It is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague Deepak Malhotra, who will speak to us. He's an expert in negotiations and deal making. Probably his most famous book, I think, is still I Moved Your Cheese, which I always love the title. Some of you might have seen his latest book, Negotiating the Impossible. We're really fortunate to have him. He's a beloved teacher here at the school who's won many awards for his teaching and even greater recognition for his deep thinking about negotiations and everything that has to do with life. Deepak, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Felix, for the very, very nice introduction. It's always nice to be introduced by other people. They always say nicer things than you could ever feel comfortable saying about yourself. Some of them are even true. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you. And I understand, as Felix mentioned, that this is pretty much the last time all of you are going to be under the same roof together, all 930-something of you, all together. And so I'm also honored to have been asked to be a part of the festivities and a part of this occasion. And when the powers that be asked me whether I would give a talk, I immediately said yes. And then they said to me I could talk about anything I wanted. And I think they thought that by saying that, they were making my life easier. Because I get to choose, I can talk about anything I want, but actually sometimes too much choice can be a bad thing. And this is one of those situations. Not because I have so many brilliant things to say that you are dying to hear and how do I pick between them, but rather because, this is an important moment. And how do you do justice to a moment like this? Sitting here in the audience, we have almost 1,000 young men and women who are ready to go out there and have the potential to change the world and make it a better place. Now, I know a few of you will go out there and change the world and make it a worse place, but by and large, the vast, vast majority of you, I am not only hopeful, but I'm confident, are going to do amazing things. And you're going to improve not only your well-being, but the well-being of people around you in countless small ways, which is the most important, but also in some cases in very big, visible ways that we'll all get to see. And so as I was thinking about what to talk about, my first instinct was I should set the bar really low, talk about something I've talked about 100 times, negotiations, the basics of deal making or something, and then I'd hurdle over that low bar. As you can see, I've decided to go a different direction. We're going to be talking about something where the bar is a little bit higher. We're going to be spending the next 20 to 30 minutes talking about, at least from my perspective, what is the purpose of education? And the reason I picked that was partly because I was feeling foolish, but partly also because I couldn't think of what else would be a good way to bridge between the time you've spent here over the last 2 years and the many years you're going to spend out in the real world navigating all sorts of different situations. Some easy, some not so easy. Dealing sometimes with difficult people, difficult decisions, difficult challenges. And so it does raise the question, what have we been doing here that might allow you to navigate those difficulties and navigate the rest of your lives in a better way? And that, from my point of view, is what the purpose of education is about. Now, people may have different theories, they may have different philosophies about it. I'm not a scholar of the history of education or a philosopher in education studies. So what I'm going to be talking to you is going to come from my experience, from what I've seen, having taught thousands of students from around the world and from my own experience as a student over the many years. And I'll lay it out there for you at the very beginning. There are lots of reasons you might want to get an education. Lots of reasons that we could probably brainstorm and come up with a pretty long list. But in my judgment, the purpose of education, above all else, is to try and increase your capacity for empathy. Above all else, that is, I think, the purpose of all education. Not just the education you receive at Harvard Business School or in any other institution of higher learning, but the purpose of all education, what we want to try and do is see if we can increase your ability to see the world from the perspective of other people. Not just the people you disagree with, but also the people you can't stand. And the people whose thoughts, whose behaviors whose ideology is absolutely abhorrent to you. As someone much wiser than me once said, we must make the effort to understand even the ununderstandable. And that's what empathy is about. And what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is tell a few stories and try to explain what I mean by that. And then try to explain why I think it's harder than it looks. And then maybe along the way even say a few things that you might find useful as you are navigating the world and the years to come. And I'm going to start out. By the way, I should say one thing before I jump into this. What I don't mean to say is that people that don't have a formal education do not have the capacity for empathy. In fact, the opposite is often the truth. It's like medicine. You know, medicine, the purpose of medicine is to make you healthy. But there's a lot of people out there not taking medicine that are in perfect health. But still, the purpose of education is to take whatever it is that we have in our ability to empathize and see if we can increase it further. Because there isn't a person in this room, and I easily put myself on the same list, who has as much empathy as they will need to deal with the situations that are to come in the years ahead. So I'll start out with a story that's personal to me. I was born in the United States, but when I was about 5 years old, my family moved to India. And I was in India for about 4.5 years. So around the age of 9.5, almost 10 years old, I came back to the US and started up school in the US again. And when you enter or re-enter a new culture, as many of you are well aware, things can be somewhat challenging. You're seeing things, you're hearing things that are different. There's challenges that are social, there's challenges that are academic or cultural. But then there was one challenge that I completely did not know how to categorize. When I would walk into the classroom and I would look on the walls, I would see maps. And I would look at those maps, and the maps would look just like the maps I'd seen in my whole life. The world looked exactly as it should, with one exception. The map of India was incorrect. And having lived in the country, I had an idea about what the map should look like. If you'd asked me about a lot of other countries, maybe not, but this should be my area of expertise. And on every globe and on every map and in every book, the map was drawn incorrectly. And it completely threw me for a loop. I couldn't understand. I mean, these are educated people. They seem to know what they're talking about, and yet they don't know what this country looks like. Now, those of you who are either from India or the South Asian subcontinent, or who just know about these issues, might have a sense of where this is going. See, if you look at the northern part of India, there's a region called Kashmir. And when I would look at the maps in the US, the map would look like this. But from my perspective, part of the northern part of the country had been lopped off. It's as if, if you're from the US and you went to a different country for the first time and you saw a map of the US and there's no Florida. Well, that might be okay, but there's no, say, Maine or something, or no Massachusetts. And you're like, what is going on? It just doesn't make sense. You have nowhere in your brain to make sense of it. And then, of course, you realize that, although I have been seeing a map that looks like this, and so you can see the difference right up top. Although I've been seeing the map on the bottom my whole life, it turns out the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world, has been seeing a very, very different map than I have. And then the realization dawns that the people on the other side of this very conflict, perhaps people in Pakistan, some people also in Kashmir, maybe they've grown up looking at an entirely different map their whole life. And you think about it, we're talking about maps. The entire purpose of a map is to help you navigate the world. And these are sometimes taking us in the wrong direction. And then you realize these people have grown up in a country where every teacher they've heard, every religious leader or politician they've heard, every newspaper they've read, every channel they've watched TV on, every single thing they've heard is different from the things you've been hearing. And it's no longer as much of a surprise why there is sometimes so much conflict. We don't see the world the way they do. We don't even think the world looks the same way. Now, here's the good news. This is many years ago. You don't go into school and look for a map on the wall so much anymore. If you want to look at what the world looks like, where do you go? Google. All right, it's not an endorsement of Google, but this is usually where people go. And so if you go to Google, the world has gotten flatter, and now we have technology, and there's a lot more communication interaction. This can and should solve the problem. So you go to Google and you type in map of India. Don't do it now because people are going to get mad at you for turning on your phone. And what you get is the map of India. And you can see there's some dotted lines up there to show that there's some disputed region and all that stuff, and that's cool. Except if you happen to be sitting at a computer in India, and you go to Google, and you type map of India, and what you get is a different map. And the map you'll see in India looks like that. And it turns out that Google has 30-some different databases that it uses for maps to show people of different parts of the world what they want to see. And this is a big problem. We are not at a point where the world is working to help us solve these problems. We're making them worse. And the first point I want to make to you, and by the way, you can do this experiment on your own. You can go to google.in and you'll go to the Indian website and you can do the same thing. This is an easy trick to check out. The first point I want to make to you, in some ways the most important, as you find yourself dealing with people that you don't get along with, people you disagree with, people who say things that just makes your blood boil, just remember, in this world at least, it doesn't take two people, at least one of whom is either evil or irrational or out to get you, to have conflict. It just takes two people, any two people. Nice, reasonably well-intentioned, reasonably smart people are fighting with each other all the time. And sometimes you need to step back and say, perhaps there's a different perspective that's underlying it. And just to bum you out a little bit more before we make things better, it gets even worse. About a year ago, I was on a flight to India. And when you're on a flight to any country, you get one of these forms like a landing card or a customs declaration card. And so I got this card and I was looking at it, and there it was. And I'm reading through all the things that I need to fill out, the basic stuff, and then I noticed something that looks kind of peculiar. It just says prohibited articles. All right, are you bringing gold? Are you bringing seeds? Are you bringing prohibited articles? I'm like, how do I know? I don't think so. But what's a prohibited article? And then I realized if you turn to the back of the sheet, it tells you what's prohibited. Now, what would you think is the number one prohibited article that you are not allowed to bring into a country? Guns, narcotics, foreign currencies. The number one thing on the list, maps and literature, where Indian external boundaries have been shown incorrectly. And this is not about India. Every country does it. I can just take a few more liberties with a country I lived in. Every country, every culture, every society does the same thing in its own ways, putting up more and more walls, making it harder and harder to see how the rest of the world sees the exact same situation. And that is something that has to change, and that raises the question, who's going to change it? Because this does not strike me as the way forward. What we need instead is to find the courage to at least examine the maps that are hanging on other people's walls. If we can't at least do that, then we are making it harder for ourselves. When I teach negotiations, I spend most of my time in the world of business and advising companies and advising folks that are doing business deals. I also spend some of my time dealing with governments when they're negotiating conflicts, like dealing with insurgents or trying to design a peace process or dealing with terrorism. And in that world, some of these ideas are even more important. They're crucial in the business world to see where other people are coming from, and a lot of you know this just from being in the world of business. One of my close friends is a man by the name of Jonathan Powell, and Jonathan Powell was the chief of staff to Tony Blair for all of the years that Tony Blair was Prime Minister of the UK. Jonathan Powell was also the chief negotiator when it came to Northern Ireland. All right, so he was a chief British negotiator on Northern Ireland, and he was responsible for the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement that helped to resolve in large part the long, protracted, seemingly intractable conflict between Protestants and Catholics. And he was responsible for trying to get that deal implemented over the next decade to follow. And he tells this really interesting story about the first time the leadership of Sinn Féin, and Sinn Féin was widely considered the political arm of the IRA, of the Irish Republican Army, when the leadership of Sinn Féin came to 10 Downing Street, which is the office and residence of the Prime Minister. And they walked into the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street. This is a picture of the cabinet room. And Martin McGuinness, who was the leader, one of the leaders of Sinn Féin, walked in, and the first thing that he said when he walked into the cabinet room was, "So this is where all the damage was done." And Jonathan and Tony thought that this was a little bit blunt and a little bit of a risky opening statement, because what had happened just a few years ago was the IRA had bombed 10 Downing Street. There had been a mortar attack that had blown up just outside this room. The windows had come down. People had had to run underneath the tables. And here comes Martin McGuinness, and the first thing he says, "So this is where all the damage was done." And it was already a tense situation. And so Jonathan says to him, "Yeah, actually, the bombs fell outside, and the windows came down, and nobody was hurt, and then eventually they were evacuated." And Martin McGuinness looks at him, completely shocked, and as Jonathan recalls, almost hurt. And he says, "I wasn't referring to the bombing." The bombing had taken place in 1991, about 6 years prior to where they were sitting. He said, "I was referring to the negotiations that took place in this room in 1921, when Michael Collins signed the treaty that led to Irish independence." He wasn't talking about the damage done by the mortar attack by the IRA. He was talking about the damage done by that one negotiation that had led to the Irish Civil War and had been fueling their side of the conflict for decades. And what Jonathan says is, and he told me, he said, the entire process of trying to achieve peace rested on one thing above all else: trying to reconcile our relatively shorter-term sense of history, of security needs, and how do we solve the problems of the last few years, and how do we reconcile our shorter-term sense of history with their much longer sense of historical grievances. And if we couldn't do that, we were not going to make any progress. And this happens all the time. It happens when you have a conflict between peoples, between nations, between cultures, and it happens when you have conflict between individuals. The same thing. Our history books are written differently. History starts from the day we were wronged, not when we wronged the other side. This is the cabinet room. This is a perspective that Martin McGuinness had. Same room 70 years earlier, just a different point of view. And just like we need the courage to examine their maps, I think we need some humility to take the steps needed to actually try and read the history books that are written by the other side, that are sitting in their libraries. And I don't think we do this often enough. But I don't want to make it sound like the problem is the world is doing it to you, the politicians make it harder, people have incentives that corrupt the system, so you know what can we do? It's much worse than that, because the worst walls that are up there are not brick and mortar walls. They're the walls that are in our own heads. And I'm going to give you an example of that. It comes from one of my students at HBS. It was actually an executive student. One of the programs I teach in is the Owner-President program, and I teach negotiations in it. And one day, I had posed a question to all of the students. And the question was, can you think of a time when something fundamentally challenged one of your basic assumptions about the world? Can you think of a time when something that you had taken for granted was challenged? And people started giving different answers about their life, about their work, about all sorts of stuff. Some pretty interesting things came out, some personal, some not so personal. And then there was a guy from Australia in the back row. And I saw his hand going a little bit up and then down. And so, of course, as a professor, that's where you go. And I said, so do you have something to share? And he says, yeah. And he tells the class, I would, for work, for business, travel to a lot of countries. And one of the continents I traveled to a lot was Africa. And I would go to sub-Saharan Africa on a number of business trips. And usually there were short trips. Fly in, get out of the airport, go to the hotel or to an office building, meet the local colleagues. When you're done, fly back. But when you travel enough and you travel to places that sometimes have poverty and other issues, you get to see what's happening on the street. And one of the things you often see in these various countries, as you all know, is extreme poverty and sometimes people begging on the street. And he says, so it was one of my many trips returning from the office after just being there for a day, and we were on the way to the airport, and we were stuck in traffic, so it was stop and go. And a little bit farther ahead, so the car was, there's the driver, and he's sitting in the back with one of his local colleagues. Up ahead and to the side, on one of the sidewalks, he sees a little kid sitting on the sidewalk, kneeling on the sidewalk. And the kid is sitting with his hands in prayer. And he says, I saw that, and the first thing that came out of my mouth was, now that's a good gimmick. And they got closer, and they got closer, and they looked over, and there was this child, about 4 years old, sitting on the sidewalk in prayer, eyes closed, tears streaming down his face. And he said, I looked at him, and never in my life had I felt so ashamed of myself. That I would see this, and the first words that would come out of my mouth is, that's a good gimmick. I didn't say anything. He said, nobody said a word. The driver didn't say anything. My colleague didn't say anything. Nobody said a single thing. He said, I have kids that age. I can't even imagine my child being in that situation. I can't even imagine what would drive a kid to be there. And there's lots of explanations we can give ourselves. He said, I could not open my mouth. He said, the image stayed with me every day. And he said, since then, he's been back to that same country, to that same city, on many occasions. And what he does now is he takes long trips. And he sets up schools, and he sets up shelters for kids like that. And we can try to spin whatever story we want about whether that's compensation enough or what's really driving that. But he had the courage to at least feel ashamed of what had happened. And yet, every one of us has done the same thing. I guarantee it. One of the most common images you will see is this. And often, one of us is one of those people walking right by. And again, we can tell a story as to why we do it. There's rational, efficiency, practical, even wise reasons why we keep walking by. But you know what? The problem is sometimes we find that the world tries to make it too easy on us. Every culture, every society comes up with its own rationale, its own mythology, why it's okay to do that. Well, the person's in that situation because of their past sins. It's just how it works. Or the poor, well, you see, their reward is in heaven, so it's all good. How convenient. Or, in more secular ways, the belief that, listen, anybody who works hard enough can get anywhere they want. So if they're not where they should be, well, you know what? They should just work harder. That's a very nice theory, very nice philosophy. It has the merit of being simple. It has the merit of making us feel comfortable. It has a slight flaw being it's complete bullshit. But it's compelling. And when we don't think deeply enough about it, it's a nice way to go about things. And perhaps one of the things we need to do, I mean, again, there's higher standards out there. This should be a low standard. You're seeing a child who will look a lot like your child. And I know most of you don't have kids yet, but you will, and you'll understand what that means. And yet, they're going to be in a situation that you cannot comprehend. And if in that moment, we can't do something better than telling ourselves a story that allows us to keep walking by, then that's a problem. And I don't want to make it sound like this is about whether you're a good person or a bad person. It has nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with it. Well, maybe something to do with it, but very little to do with it. You can be the nicest person, have the best intentions, but you can still be lacking in empathy in these basic ways. Or you might even have empathy. It's just not readily available when it's needed most. And I'll give you an example of that. Back in 2001, it was a year before I joined the faculty here, I took a summer and I went to the University of Pennsylvania and I did a summer fellowship program where they brought in people from different parts of the world, from different types of work and different experiences. I was somebody who was getting a PhD at a business school. There was journalists there. There was people that were clinical psychologists, anthropologists, people that worked on various issues. But the fellowship was about ethnopolitical conflict. So we were going to spend about 2.5 months studying ethnic conflict, causes, consequences, everything related to it. And it was just an amazing summer. But one night, there was 15 of us fellows. We went out to dinner. And one of the women that was with us was just this amazing person who had devoted so much of her life trying to bridge between Jewish Israelis and Arab Palestinians. She was a Jewish Israeli woman, and she had spent the last many, many years trying to make inroads and changing attitudes and trying to bring people together in various programs like Seeds of Peace and such. It wasn't Seeds of Peace, but things like that. And the conversation went a certain way, and she said, you know what? Just the one thing I wish everybody here would understand is how difficult it is to change these things. People come in from the outside, they have these grand theories, but it is not easy. You can work your whole life to try to solve the problem, and one small thing can tear it apart. And somebody says, well, what do you mean? And she says, I'll give you an example. She was running one of these workshops, 5-day, 6-day, 7-day programs, and there was a bunch of relatively young, but adults, Jewish Israelis and Arab Palestinians who had come into this program. She was one of the organizers. And there were some Arab organizers as well. She said one evening everybody was off doing their own dinner, and a few of us, who all happened to be Jewish Israelis, had gone to a restaurant. About half an hour or 45 minutes into it, a few other folks showed up. They all happened to be Arab Palestinians, and this happens to take place in Israel. She said, we were eating, we were probably halfway through our meal, and we noticed that these fellow workshop participants of ours had come in and were waiting to be seated. And then it took a little bit longer, and then it took a little bit longer. And then it became pretty clear that they weren't going to be seated very easily. And then it started getting tense, and then there was some arguing, and it seemed pretty straightforward that they weren't being treated well. And after a while, and they'd seen us, and we'd seen each other, we'd said hello, and then it got kind of crazy, and then they walked out, and they left. And she said this was 5 days into the program. On day 6, we were worse off than we had been on day 1. It just destroyed everything. It almost made people feel like, what's the point? What is the point of us getting along with a few people when this is the world we're living in? So she tells this story, and I say to her, just instinctively, I said, so when they left, why didn't you guys leave with them? And she says, never occurred to me. We didn't come in with it. It just didn't occur to me. I said, well, what do you think? What would have happened if you had actually gotten up and left, paid your bill and left because they were walking out? And she thought about it for a moment, and she said, it probably would have changed everything. Because the next day, they would have been in it together. Now, like I said, this is among the nicest people you will ever meet. Not just the nicest person in theory, in practice, doing all of the things she can think of to make it better. And she can do it 100 times better than I can. But what we can all sometimes find when we're on the outside is those missed opportunities. And the mistake we will make is to think that empathy is one of the things we should keep in our toolkit. We got to have courage, we got to have creativity, we got to have this and that, and mathematical skill, and the ability to laugh it off. And empathy is one of the tools we should have in our toolkit. It doesn't belong in a toolkit. Empathy is the one thing that belongs on your fingertips all the time, at the tip of your tongue, in the top of your mind, because otherwise those small situations, which are in some ways very big situations, will be missed opportunities. And what I'm saying to you is, it's not new. It's not something I came up with. It's just reflections on what I've been seeing, and reflections on things that have been happening for many years before I came into the picture. I'll tell you one last story just to put it a little bit in context. If you go back in history and you ask the question, what would be the most basic, elemental, most ancient lesson when it comes to peacemaking? I think there's a good candidate for it. there is something known as the Treaty of Kadesh. I don't think this is something that would have been talked about at the B School. It's not something that comes up often, so I'll give you a little bit of background. It was signed in the 13th century BC. All right, so we're talking over 3,000 years ago. What's interesting about it, it is the oldest peace treaty known to humanity. You can go as far back as you want. You can't get older than that and find something where you can find the text of the treaty. And the treaty was signed between two societies, between the Egyptians and the Hittites. And they'd been at war and they'd been fighting, but the fighting had been going on for a long time. It was getting costly. They had other internal and external threats, so they needed to somehow end this war. But as is often the case in these situations, if you go in there asking for peace, you look weak, so you don't want to do that. And so there's a lot of barriers to kind of getting these negotiations even going. But somehow they overcame those and they signed the treaty. Now what's amazing about this peace treaty is that we actually have two versions of it. So we sort of know it's authentic and we can kind of make sense of what's in it. There's a Hittite version, and then there is the Egyptian version. So the Hittite version is written in Akkadian, the Egyptian version is written in hieroglyphics, but it's the same treaty. And when you read these two, what you find out is, I can't read them, but the people that know how to read this stuff, when you read these, you find out that, you know what, they're very similar to the kinds of peace treaties we've seen for the millennia and centuries to follow. There's terms about, how they're going to have, no invasion, return of each other's soldiers, and some other kinds of pacts, and all sorts of stuff. And they're basically identical, as well they should be. But there's one difference between these two versions of the treaty. Everything else is basically the same, but one thing is different. In the Hittite version, it says it was the Egyptians who came asking for peace. And in the Egyptian version, it says it was the Hittites who came begging for peace. And this one simple notion, the idea that everybody on every side of every conflict needs to find a way to declare victory, is at least as old as known history. You can be in an argument with a person, you can be right, it's not going to be good enough. You can be in a big dispute or in a big negotiation, there's a lot at stake. Often I remind my students, think about what it is that you're asking the other side to say yes to. And ask yourself, how can they possibly say yes and still declare victory? How will they do so? Because if they can't, if there's no way for them to do that, well, then you may find yourself forcing them to choose between doing what's smart and doing what helps them save face. And you don't want people to make that choice because too often they'll do what helps them save face. And this is true in just about every situation you will find, in small and in big. And it will raise the same question, can we begin to see the world the way they see it? Can we understand not just their perspective, but how are their hands tied? How are they constrained? What are the things that they also wish they could do but can't do? Because if you don't make allowances for that, you are bound to judge them more harshly than you should. It's important to have empathy, but it's also important to use empathy. And the mistake we often make is that we somehow think that empathy is something you do because you're a nice person. It's something you do with people who deserve it. In my experience, it's exactly the opposite. Empathy is needed most when you are dealing with people who seem to deserve it the least. That's when it matters. That's when it counts. Otherwise, you don't need it. You don't need to make peace with your friends. You need to make it with your enemies. You don't need to bridge the gap between people who agree. You need to bridge the gap when you're dealing with folks who disagree with you, who see the world in such a different way that you cannot even understand it, which goes back to the effort we must make to understand even the ununderstandable. And when you go out there, you're not going to necessarily be negotiating peace treaties or dealing with political leaders who see things differently, or really even obsessing over what it says in a custom declaration form. You can leave that to other people, but you're going to be dealing with other people. And the purpose of education, in my view, and the measure of our success as educators and your success as students fundamentally comes down to this. Are you walking away every day with a slightly better ability to understand the other side? If you are the one hurting other people, are you doing a better job understanding the other side? If you are the one being hurt, are you doing a better job understanding the people who may have hurt you? And if the answer is yes, then we're moving in the right direction. That's why you walk into a class with people that are so different from you. That's why you read cases about how people have tried to solve things and argue about it. That's why, in most cases, we use a Socratic method to let you argue it out and figure it out. These are all small experiments. But every day you have many, many of these when you're walking down the hall, when you're having a meeting with your section mates, when you're sitting in a discussion group, when you're thinking about different cultures that were represented in a case. It is an opportunity to see the world from a different point of view. And if we can all do that a little bit better, we can perhaps create the kind of value we want to create and make the kind of changes we want to make. And not just the big ones, but the small ones. And I'll end. I had no idea what you were hoping to get out of this session, if you got anything, but this is, once you get on a roll, this is the direction we're going. I'm going to end with one basic thought. If you can't do everything, if you won't remember or don't agree with any of this, then try to remember at least one thing. It's something that I struggle with, and I think it's something that everybody struggles with. When you're out there dealing with other human beings, dealing with the world, dealing with difficult situations, try as well as you can to look at the world through gentler eyes. Look at the world through gentler eyes than you would. Give the benefit of the doubt. Ask more questions. Step back and say, how, despite the fact that I think what they're saying is ridiculous, if not evil, how do they go to sleep at night thinking it's okay to say or do or think those things? And you may come to the conclusion at the end of all of that, nope, these are still jerks. But don't start with that assumption. Look at the world through gentler eyes and see what it might create for you as you go forward. And think about all the good you will do, not just for yourself, but all the people that you'll run into. They won't always come and thank you, but you will have done it. I'm going to stop here. We're sort of way over time, and I've taught exec ed the last year or two, and they don't complain about going over time, so I'm a little rusty when it comes to time limits. I'm happy to stick around a little bit longer. There's going to be a video coming up next. I'll hang out here, and I'll be on the Spangler lawn as well. If you have any reactions, any questions, any comments, jokes to tell, insults, anything, I'll be around. And if I don't chat with you, if I don't see you again, good luck to all of you. Do great things, and do good things.